With all the headlines over the past week about flooding, damage, and evacuations, stories about flood assistance are coming next. Now, a column in Maclean's magazine is getting some attention. It's called "It's Time We Stop Paying for Your River View." And in it, Scott Gilmore says it's time to rethink zoning laws and why people are allowed to build and live on floodplains. Scott Gilmore joins me today from Ottawa. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Ben.
All right, your argument essentially says that homeowners and local governments are to blame for the damage caused in recent floods. Can you explain how they're at fault?
Well, it's local government, municipalities, that decide whether or not an area should be zoned for residential use. But it's federal and provincial governments that pay for the cost of living in a floodplain. And so what we're seeing happen again and again and again is floods, which are becoming much more predictable and, in fact, creating more damage now than they ever have, are literally being subsidized by taxpayers who don't live in floodplains.
So if I follow this to its logical conclusion, does this mean that we should deny government assistance to those whose homes have been flooded?
Well, I wouldn't say we make a stark decision such as that, but we do need to wean it off. We do have to push some of these costs onto the people who take the decisions to zone those neighborhoods or to buy houses there. So, for example, right now, it's mandatory to have insurance if you want to put a car on the road. I think it should be mandatory to have flood insurance if you want to own a home. And when you call up your insurance company and you discover it's going to cost $10,000 a year to get flood insurance because you live next to a river, it might cause some of these homeowners to think, maybe this isn't such a good idea to live here.
One of the most interesting things, and I think frustrating things that I read in your article is that you said government budgets for disaster relief have been rising over years, even though our ability to detect natural disasters has been improving. Talk to me about that, because it shouldn't be that way.
No, there has been a social compact in this country based on this pioneering ethic that, as Canadians push out into the wilderness, the rest of Canada is going to take on some of that risk. And that made sense in the 1800s. But right now, we can tell down to a centimeter whether your house is liable to flood or not. And in fact, the Insurance Bureau of Canada has found that 1.8 million Canadian households are at very high risk of flooding. So this isn't a secret that your house is in danger, and that being the case, it should no longer be a risk that the rest of us have to cover.
Scott, if 1.8 million homes are at high risk of being flooded, why are they still considered so valuable in the eyes of local government?
Well, it's because the market's broken. The costs are not being properly distributed. So right now, if I want to go buy a beautiful home with a river view, no one is obligated to tell me whether or not that house is flooded before. I'm not obligated to buy any insurance for flood risk. And if it does flood, I'll probably get some compensation from the feds and from the provinces. And so those costs, you're not even thinking about them. If you were told this house actually floods every 5 years and you're going to have to pay X amount of dollars for insurance, then I think a lot of people will suddenly realize, the value of what I'm willing to pay for that house just got cut in half.
So if nobody's obligated to share that information, and we're essentially dealing with an information deficit here, and then you learn that according to a 2017 study out of Waterloo University, 94% of homeowners who lived in flood risk areas didn't actually know it. Why do you think there is such a lack of awareness around this, and why is there an unwillingness of governments to force that information to be shared?
Well, there's two things here. There's willful blindness. I mean, we all walk into a store, we don't intend to buy something, we walk out and we don't know how that happened. It's because we really, really wanted it. And a lot of homeowners really, really want to live near a river or a river valley. It's beautiful, it's pleasant. And so they're not willing to pause for a moment and say, wait a second, it's next to a river, rivers rise. The second problem is that while the data exists, it's not readily presented to us. It's a little hard to find, but I can tell your viewers, if they want to know if their house is at flood risk, they only have to make one phone call. Call their insurer. Their insurer will be able to tell them immediately whether or not their house is at risk and how much it would cost to insure it.
All right, Scott, so those are the problems. What's the first thing we do to solve this problem?
Well, I think the very first thing we do is we get municipalities obligated to buy flood insurance themselves, because that will force city councils to take these decisions about zoning and floodplains much more carefully. If they have to cover the costs of the insurance and they have to cover the costs of possible flooding, they're not going to be quite so ambitious. And at the same time, they may pay a little bit more attention to building up some of the infrastructure that will prevent flooding. The second thing we should do, as I've mentioned before, is force homeowners to buy flood insurance. The next let's start reducing some of that money that the federal government's making available. Like you said, it's $280 million this year. It's already doubled over the last few years, and it's expected to triple again over the next couple of years. Flooding is the single most expensive natural disaster facing this country.
Maclean's magazine columnist Scott Gilmore, food for thought. Thanks again.